Hey everyone, this week we are going to look at sociological research. As part of our human experience, we often wonder about the different behaviors we see within our societies. Sociologists attempt to answer many questions about our social world through sociological research. They look at questions on a large scale, like the correlation between, let's say, the amount of sleep and level of happiness for nurses statewide, or on a smaller scale, such as the correlation between sleep and happiness for nurses at a specific hospital or at a few hospitals within a city. Pretty much any question you might have in regards to human behavior is fair game. Um, because we as people are made up of our own personal experiences, we must keep this bias in mind when performing research. For this reason, we must use empirical evidence. This type of evidence comes from direct experiences, scientifically gathered data, or experiments. To gather the empirical evidence, we use the scientific method. Many of you are probably familiar with this method, but a refresher or an introduction is always a good idea. So let's talk about some elements of good research, okay? So as we get started, it's important to kind of understand these elements. This would include reliability and validity. When we talk about reliability, we are talking about the likelihood that the results can be replicated. So if another researcher were to perform the same study, they would get the same results. Validity just means that the study measures what it was designed to measure. So if you were looking at adult athletics and weight loss, the end results would only have adult outcomes and their weight loss rather than adding in the teenage area or the teenage age range and their athletic weight loss as well. Let's just look at some of the different steps in the scientific method. Okay, so first thing we would need to do would be to ask a question or identify the area of interest. Without this, we would not know where to go next. The question needs to be narrow enough for the study. Would need to be narrow enough to study within a specified population and time frame. It's really important to come up with an operational definition for your study. So, what is an operational definition? It's the way that the researchers decide they will measure the variables they are studying. Some studies have looked at child aggression on the playground. This can be a pretty broad topic, but with a clear operational definition of what aggression is, then the researchers can objectively measure it. It's important to know that operational definitions are specific to the research for which it's being used. So you will most likely come up with a different way to define aggression than other researchers and other studies. The most important thing that you can come up with um, is that you can come up with a new way to measure your variable so that the researchers can all collect the same data and so that anyone trying to replicate the study knows exactly what was measured and how it was measured. Step 2. After you figure out what you're doing, what you're going to study, the next step would be to look at how others have researched the same question. This can help you improve your design. It can help you see what other areas might need to be looked into, and it will give you a better idea of how you can add to the sociological research field. When you're doing literature reviews, you should use scholarly and credible journal sources. The library has a great database for scholarly journals. You can also look at Google Scholar as well as the reference page on articles that you've already read, and you can find some existing sources that they've used. Okay, so step 3. The next step would be to formulate a hypothesis or an assumption about how the variables you are studying are related. In research, this often means you'll predict how one form of behavior influences the other. As the researchers, you will pick a behavior, which will be known as the independent variable, and then look for the influence or change it has on another variable, which is known as the dependent variable. The independent variable will stay the same and is the cause of change. The dependent variable will be the thing that changes in the study and is the effect. So if we are looking at social class and level of education, social class would remain the same, making it the independent variable. And then the level of education would differ among the study participants, making it the dependent variable. It's important to know that because the nature of human behavior is fluid and oftentimes changes, some researchers prefer to work with an interpretive framework. They do not start with a strict hypothesis, but they remain open to ideas to gain a better understanding of the world from the participant's point of view. It is more descriptive and it allows for more in-depth knowledge and understanding of the person or the group that's being studied. There are various methods to use in research, but before we get into that, let's briefly talk about what is called the Hawthorne effect, which is actually something that we are all quite familiar with. Have you ever changed your behavior at school, at work, or at home because either your teacher, your boss, or your parent were watching you? That is exactly what the Hawthorne effect is. People changing their behavior because they know they are being watched. So how does this apply to research? Well, participants can change their behavior to what they think the researcher is studying. They might act less natural or give answers that they think the researcher is looking for. Not telling the participants the exact thing you are measuring in your study can help decrease the chances for the Hawthorne effect to happen. Okay, so when you're doing research, you will generally use quantitative or qualitative methods. Quantitative methods have more focus on numbers or statistics, while qualitative methods are more subjective and either use or try to imitate a natural setting. Surveys. As you collect your data, you will have to decide the best way for your study. Surveys are a popular way for researchers to collect data. They are easy to distribute, especially with today's technology, and they can reach a large number of people in a short amount of time. They are often used to gauge behaviors or people's opinions. It's important to identify your population or who will be the focus of your study. And then once you know that, then you can figure out how to reach a sample of that population. The sample represents the larger population and it should be selected randomly, meaning that everyone in your given population has the same chance of being chosen to participate. So if you were looking at college students receiving financial aid, MCC could be your population. And then you can say that every 25th person enrolled in all of the MCC programs or campuses would receive a survey via email. This gives you a smaller, more manageable sample to work with, and it allows for the sample to be random. Interviews. These are one-on-one conversations that you would have with a research subject. You would ask a series of questions and then the participant could answer them basically however they want. This gives more in-depth answers and information and also allows for clarification to an answer if needed. The Hawthorne effect could come into play here, so you have to be careful with what you ask, with how you phrase things, or just kind of how you are coming across towards the research subjects. Field research involves the researcher going out into the environment that they wish to study. The interpretive framework we talked about before comes into play here as the main source for obtaining information rather than using the scientific method. This is a popular approach for sociologists as they look for answers to questions that they may have regarding human behavior and interaction. It is important to know that in the field research, you are looking for correlation and not causation. So just because two things happen together does not mean that one of them caused the other thing. For example, there is a correlation between higher ice cream sales and greater incidence of drowning deaths. Does this mean that if lots of ice cream is sold, then more people will drown? No, it doesn't. It just means that the two things happen to be occurring at the same time. In our example, hot weather is a common variable for both, so it's important to look at other factors that could be involved. Let's take a quick look at the different types of field research. First, we have participant observation. The researcher will join in and participate to fully experience the social life or society being studied. Think of the show Undercover Boss. The boss would pretend to do the work of the employee. He would pretend he's just one of the employees, fitting in, just doing everything that they do, participating fully as one of the employees to get a feel for what life was really like in their shoes. Okay. Next, we have an ethnography, and this is an objective observation of an entire community. These are generally quite lengthy and allows for an in-depth analysis of an entire community. It gives you a look at how the groups are organized, social norms, and the day-to-day interactions. This is an objective observation and allows the researcher to discover how people view themselves in relation to their community. The third one is a case study. And this is an in-depth analysis of a single event, situation, or individual. It is important to remember that case studies are not generalizable, but they are specific to the given population, person, or the event being studied. For example, if someone were to study the after effects of one of the many recent natural disasters, they would only be gathering information and results for that particular population in that city, and not the after effects of flood victims elsewhere or other natural disasters somewhere else in the country or the world. Okay, let's see. So experiment. There are times when you might have a question that needs testing, and for this, you will want to use experimental methods. This allows you to investigate the relationships between variables to test a hypothesis. There are two main types of experiments: lab-based experiments and natural or field experiments. Lab-based experiments allow for the environment to be easily controlled. Some of you might be familiar with the Bobo doll experiment. They looked at how children would model behavior and set up in a lab an experiment to test their hypotheses. The other type is the field-based or natural experiment. Breaching experiments, where people break a social norm and see how people react to them, are quite popular on the internet these days. The natural experiment might be a bit more accurate since it's not set up in a lab, but they both have their place in sociological research. The last approach we will talk about is secondary data analysis. This type of research involves studying already completed work of others. Researchers would look at public records, newspapers, media, and other similar sources. If you were to do content analysis, you would look at, say, magazines over a year and find different trends that might be occurring. You could also look at several magazines from the same month and see if there are any trends among those. Because of the nature of the source that is used in this type of research, it's very unobtrusive. As a researcher, sociologists have an ethical obligation to avoid harming subjects. They must also obtain an informed consent prior to a research subject participating in the study. The participants must always be informed of any potential risks, and participants are volunteers and they may choose to withdraw from the study at any time. All right, well, be sure to read the chapter and use this as a supplement to your readings, and post any questions you might have in the Got Questions section of our course.